Hi everyone, this is a tutorial on how to do qualitative analysis. I'm going to focus on two different methods in this video. I'm going to look at grounded coding, which is more inductive in its approach, versus content analysis, which is more deductive in the approach. I say more in that these are not mutually exclusive and there's induction and deduction required in both approaches, but the general principles underlying these two approaches depend on whether you are starting from data or you are starting from trying to prove some relationship. So the first one I'm going to look at is grounded coding. In both examples, I'm going to use the selfies data that I used for a study of how people presented themselves on Instagram. So, in terms of the research questions that induction or grounded coding can address, they're very much exploratory kind of questions. They answer questions that start with words like how, or what, or why. But in terms of these questions, they tend to be fairly broad, and they may or may not know what the answer is going to look like at the end. When I say this, I'll compare it to the content analysis when I show you that, to show the differences by what I mean by not knowing what you're looking for. Okay, so here's the research question that I had. How are selfies used as communication tools to narrate human brands? So in this question, it tells me what I'm looking at. I'm looking at selfies, and I'm looking at communication, and I'm looking at narration, and I'm looking at ideas of human brands. So this question tells me what I'm looking at, but it doesn't tell me what I'm looking for. So in terms of the method, so the site was Instagram. We accidentally ended up with 5,005 selfies. Long story. We used an automated collecting tool called If This Then That. It doesn't work with Instagram anymore, so I use a different method these days. But in what I'm going to report here, it was a study of 1,000 of the 5,000 that we collected. So the approach to the analysis was to understand the narrative of selfies as composite texts, and composite texts are images and words, where neither the image nor the text were privileged over the other. So often in these kind of studies, people will analyze the image or they'll analyze the text, but very rarely do both get analyzed together. So my analysis procedure was, first, I looked at the image and what was shown. So from these three selfies on the right hand side, you can see they're quite similar in terms of their structural dimensions. The second thing I looked at was what was said. So this was a content analysis of the posts. Often it required basically interpreting what all these hashtags actually mean. For instance, the idea of like for like. As someone who doesn't use Instagram, I was not entirely sure what like for like meant, especially when you get over to more specific ones. It says L for LFL, and I had to do some Google searches to find out what that is. There's things in Instagram, follow for follow, F for F, these sorts of hashtags that have very specific meanings in the context that I didn't understand as a non-Instagram user, and in terms of interpreting what was being said, I had to figure out what these hashtags meant. Then we combine the two together. So we read the composite selfie, so I had to compare the results from stage 1 and 2, what was in the image, what was in the text, to then interpret what is the story being told. So in the first one, we interpreted this as being an autobiography story. It tells the story of a bored girl at a party, and this is what she does. So she's just telling something about her life and about herself. In the second selfie, we we interpreted this as being parody or comedy of some sort, because essentially she's making a joke about the American Psychiatric Association classifying selfies as a mental problem. So, and she's doing a send up saying, I better take a selfie now. And in the final selfie, we classified this as propaganda. So in these this is basically selfies in order to try and attract more followers. So in these like for like hashtags, follow for follow, like for like, these hashtags are designed to attract an audience. Essentially they say, if you like my photo, I will like your photo, so we'll all have a bigger audience. So in doing all this interpretation of these different stories that the combination of text and image was telling, we came up with 7 key types of selfie genres: autobiography, parody, propaganda, romance, self-help, travel diary, and coffee table book. So I can show you in more detail what all of these are, but I'll do these fairly quickly. Basically, autobiography is about telling people about your life. Parody is about making a joke either of yourself or in some instances about social media or life in general. Propaganda is all about building an audience. Basically, if you see over on the left hand side, you'll see a lot of follow for follow, like for like, those sorts of hashtags being used. The romance selfies were either the happy romance, which you'll see on the left, of people together, and the story being told about the selfie is very much about people together and being happy together. And on the right hand side we have the tragic romance of people alone, noting the people or a person who's not being shown in the photo. So this sort of social togetherness versus social separation. We then have the self-help selfies. These were quite similar to the propaganda ones, but instead they were taking a tone of, I'm an expert and I have something to teach you. So they were trying to build an audience, but it was building an audience through offering some sort of knowledge exchange and success. Then we had the travel diary selfies. These are people putting themselves in a particular place. So either in the ski fields, the Petronas Towers, Coachella, I think that's how it's pronounced, Chinatown, Spain. So these were people taking a selfie of themselves in a place, sort of this wish you were here kind of selfie, or aren't you jealous you aren't here with me. And the final type of selfie was what we call a coffee table book. These were selfies that were done basically as sort of playing on the artistic elements of photography and of selfie as an art form. So my particular favorite is this one here of what appears to be a man in a street. But what's particularly why I like this one so much is this is a 3D printout of this man. So he went to all the effort of scanning his whole body in, printing it out, taking it to a street in New York, and then taking a, in brackets, selfie of himself, or a 3D printout of himself in a street. So this idea of playing with the medium and playing with this notion of what is a selfie and playing with photography is very much about this coffee table. It's artistic, and it was for casual conversation starters. So we then build a summary of our findings. So all of these things together build a theoretically based, what's called typology, but can also be then used by others to form the basis of what is then called a coding frame for further types of analysis, which I'll explain in a minute. So that is the process of grounded theory. You don't know exactly what you're looking for in the data. It's a matter of basically analyzing it, building categories, looking at what those categories tell you about what's going on and their relationship to each other, and then building theories. In this case, we built a theory around genres of selfies in people's narrative storytelling about themselves online. So, ending with the coding frame or the typology of selfie narratives from the previous study, they're going to move on to qualitative analysis using deduction. And the most extreme form of this is what's called content analysis. So in content analysis, very much you are starting from a position where you want to test something. You are looking for something particular in your data. What this ends up looking like is, instead of having a research question that's quite broad, often in content analysis they will start with an hypothesis. A hypothesis? I don't know. So here's an example of a hypothesis that a content analysis study might start with. So my hypothesis here is that Instagrammers who use propaganda narratives in their selfies have a high number of followers. You'll notice in this hypothesis that it is a yes-no statement. All hypotheses must be able to be answered with either yes or no. It's what makes it a hypothesis, because we are testing the data or testing the world, the observations of the world, in order to find out whether this statement is true or not. So therefore a hypothesis statement must be either yes, no, true, not true, supported, not supported. So again, we have a similar method of data collection. Start with our 5,005 selfies. I'll use the same 1,000 selfies, but I'll add additional data in the number of followers that the Instagram user has, according to the data we collected using the if this then that service. So the analysis approach that we are using here is to identify propaganda selfies versus other types of selfies, and to compare the number of followers between these two groups of selfie sharers. So we start with this coding frame. In particular, we're looking at the propaganda selfies, which I have highlighted in blue. These are the attributes of a propaganda selfie that we are looking for in our data. But we need to be able to see whether we can differentiate propaganda selfies consistently from other types of selfies. So in this kind of study, the first step we need to do is determine the reliability of this typology as a coding frame for differentiating selfies. So what we would do is give a subset of selfies from the different selfie types to two different independent coders, or sometimes they are called raters. And we would give them the coding frame that had been developed, and the coders independently, they can't talk to each other about it, would then go through all the different selfies in the sample that we had given them and code them at the type that they interpret or see each type of selfie or each example of a selfie as being related to. So in the first example, both coders have coded it as autobiographical, the second one travel diary, third one propaganda, fourth one parody, up until N, where they've coded it as coffee table. So we have a high degree of what we call intercoder reliability. How would we then calculate this? Well, what we do is we then add a column, essentially agreement, 0 is no, 1 for yes. So if they are in agreement, I have changed some of the answers here to give a better idea of how this would work. and that should be a 1, not a 0, so my data is incorrect and not very reliable. Stick with me here. So that should be a 1. That would mean that these are four times out of 5 the coders have agreed, leading to an 80% level of reliability. Of course, we would not give coders only 5. We would give them a significant portion of data to analyze. The amount of that data is a bit of a something to be determined. There are no hard and fast rules with that one, but you might do 100, 150, 200. The same with sampling. The more data that you do this on in terms of conducting this kind of analysis, the more reliable your results. So I have about 80% inter-coder reliability or inter-rater reliability, but because I'm only interested in the propaganda, I could do the reliability test just on the coder's ability to differentiate the propaganda selfies from the other types of selfies. So it depends on what I'm looking at as to how I would then check the reliability. Or I could do both types of tests and report both types of tests, because that shows my credibility and in the openness with which I am reporting my findings. So we take this reliability test and we would then use a different data set. I have it here because getting images is a pain into PowerPoint, but we would then get propaganda versus non-propaganda selfies, and we would get a code for whether it was a propaganda or other. So this is an other, propaganda, other, propaganda. We would then also get the number of followers that these users of Instagram have, and then we would run a statistical test. We haven't got that far yet in terms of which would be the appropriate test to run. Just believe me, it is an independent sample t-test, which compares sample 1, propaganda selfies, versus sample 2, non-propaganda selfies, and versus how many followers they have. So, in terms of the findings, how would this be then reported? So we go back to our hypothesis that Instagrammers who use propaganda narratives in their selfies have a higher number of followers. So our findings are from running an independent sample t-test. The statistical output would tell me whether the t-test supports my hypothesis. So if the t-test supports my hypothesis that propaganda narrative users in Instagram have statistically higher numbers of users than other types of selfies, I would then accept my hypothesis and say that propaganda narratives are more effective at gaining more followers in Instagram. However, if my statistical analysis was not showed and there was no significant difference between propaganda versus other types of selfies, then I would reject my hypothesis and conclude that the use of propaganda narratives is not an effective way of increasing the number of followers you have in Instagram. So these is the kind of conclusion that you can draw and the kind of question that you can answer using content analysis. I hope you can see that it's a very different type of question, analysis procedure, and conclusion that is drawn from both types of analysis procedures. So in summary, you can say that grounded coding builds categories and theory from the data, and it often ends with the development of a coding frame. Whereas content analysis tests assumptions and theories and starts with a coding frame. So hashtag V, hashtag N. There will be another video that deals with more generally what qualitative analysis actually is.